It's been 20 years, and the news that women are earning 82 cents for every dollar earned by men is still percolating. It hasn't budged, that stat, not a cent. This is despite the fact that women are now the slight majority of the college-educated labor force. The New York Times cites one of the key contributors to the gender pay gap as the motherhood penalty and the corresponding fatherhood premium. Women's pay decreases when they have children, while men's pay increases. The Times article comes not long after Chiefs kicker Harrison Butker's commencement speech encouraging women to be homemakers went viral. In his first public comments since the speech, Butker doubled down. Let's take a look.
If it wasn't clear that the timeless Catholic values are hated by many, it is now. Over the past few days, my beliefs, or what people think I believe, have been the focus of countless discussions around the globe. At the outset, many people expressed a shocking level of hate, but as the days went on, even those who disagreed with my viewpoints shared their support for my freedom of religion.
Joining us now to discuss it all is author of Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net, and an associate professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin, Jessica Calarco. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's interesting because right off the bat, I find myself disjointed. Butker's remarks there seem to be a little bit missing the mark for why he's being criticized. It's not exactly about the gender pay gap, right? It's about the maybe wisdom of addressing a group of college graduates who presumably have gone to college, at least in part, because they have an interest in pursuing a career outside of the home and have spent a lot of money to get a degree to do so, and saying that the women who have done so are missing the mark, are wasting their time, or would be better, it's better spend their time doing something other than what they've been training to do. I mean, what do you make of all of this controversy?
I mean, I think we have to think about where are these ideas coming from and what role are men like Butker playing in promoting these kinds of sexist myths. I mean, I think the core of what he's saying is that women are happier at home, that even if women have gone to college and pursued careers, that they're happiest in the home caring for young children. And that kind of a mythology actually does relate very directly to this gender pay gap, because research shows that one of the strongest predictors of gender pay gaps cross-nationally is how deeply people buy into sexist myths, into sexist ideologies about things like, women just being happiest at home. And essentially that's what I find in my research too, is that these ideas are widely prevalent, that roughly half of all American parents believe that it's best for children if mothers stay home. And, other surveys show that there's also widespread belief that this is where women are happiest as well. And this helps to justify families' kinds of decisions to sacrifice women's careers when it comes to, when they run into childcare challenges and when they find difficulties being able to afford things like childcare.
Well, a couple things there. I mean, would you dispute that? I don't care if it's the mother or the father, but I think there is some research showing that it is better if one of the parents is able to be home with at least very young children. When I hear, what Harrison Butker had to say there, I heard him say that some women will be happier staying at home being mothers. Not that necessarily is the right choice for everyone, but that is a choice just as valid as the choice to have a professional career. And I don't, if there are fathers who want to stay home with the child, that's fine with me. That's actually happening in more situations that I know of, but just that some parent should be home with the child.
Sure, I think we have to think about how, yes, certainly in the early weeks after children are born, it makes sense to have parents be home and have access to things like universal paid family leave to make sure that families can bond with their new babies and be able to learn parenting skills. And that's equally important for moms and for dads in those kinds of situations. At the same time, research shows that high quality childcare is great for kids and great for parents, and that it's not necessarily best for children, especially beyond those kind of early weeks, for parents to stay home with their children. And I think the problem there becomes that we often push women to be the ones to sacrifice their paid careers, that even if, it could be either parents staying home, surveys suggest that disproportionately families in the U.S. and people in the U.S. seem to think that it's better if it's moms. And that kind of gendered ideology operates in ways to make men feel like they can be the good guys, even if they end up exploiting women's labor, even if they end up relying on their wives, for example, to care for their children, because they can buy into this idea that women are just happier or children are just better off, despite some of the evidence to suggest otherwise.
Yeah, I do think that the frustration with Butker is the way he tends to frame this as tends to frame women's choice to, let's say, not stay home with children and be a primary homemaker as a choice. As a leftist, part of my priority is to make sure that there are social supports to enable parents, regardless of their gender, to make those kind of parenting decisions based on what they think is best for their children, as opposed to financial constraints. But framing it as he does, as women are working because they feel like it's sexist to stay at home, really does obscure how many more women are driven into the workplace, because most families rely on 2 salaries to subsist in the first place. And so that's why I want to come back to asking you more about these the gender pay gap and these premiums you describe, because if both people have to work, well, then that's a broader, because of money, that's a broader social conversation that we need to address. But if one person does have the ability to stay home, but it is disproportionately the women, because women are being penalized for having children at work, whereas men are getting an additional economic benefit for having children at work, then that does seem to be a structural problem that should be addressed.
Absolutely. These gender pay gaps are operating in ways that make it seem not only natural, but logical for mothers to be the ones to sacrifice their careers. I mean, many of the couples that I've talked to in my research, even before they have children, women are earning less than men are. I talked to one couple, for example, where she was a social worker. She was earning about $30,000 a year before they had kids, where he was working in IT, making $90,000 a year. And if we think about the fact that she had a master's degree while he had only a bachelor's degree, we could imagine that maybe her job should be paid more. But because of how we devalue care work in U.S. society, because it's work that often is difficult to make a profit from without, and certainly requires high levels of government investment, we tend to underpay those jobs and push women into those jobs in ways that then make it easy for those couples to justify having women, sacrifice their careers. And that's what that couple ended up doing once they had children. And because of the high costs of childcare, they decided that it didn't make sense financially. The husband talked about it as sacrifice. It didn't make sense to spend half of her paycheck finding care. Because she was making so little, it made it seem, relative to what he was making, it made it seem easier to justify having her be the one to stay home. And that's certainly the case in many families. And those patterns are even more exacerbated for lower income families, who may end up cash negative if they have to pay for full-time childcare, if both parents are continuing to work full-time. And because of those gender pay gaps, it often does end up making more sense financially for moms to be the ones to sacrifice their careers.
Well, no, Jessica, that's tough, because in that scenario, I think a lot of people are going to listen to that and say, well, obviously, if one parent makes $90,000 a year and one makes $30,000 a year, and they need childcare, and they would prefer, a lot of people prefer childcare not to happen outside of the home for a whole host of reasons. People have children because they do want to spend time with them, often case. That, of course, the woman, in this case, the lower earning partner, should be the one to stay at home. And to the extent that the kinds of jobs that women tend to go for are lower paid, I think that is a broader conversation to have. But in that scenario, it does seem kind of obvious. Well, you made a choice to do low paid work. And did you not anticipate at some point that you were going to have to stay home at some point, just because of the biology of having a baby, and that this is sort of a bed that you made for yourselves? I mean, is it the most sympathetic argument to talk about low-income workers choosing to stay home, which does feel more like a choice, as opposed to examples where a man and a woman working the same job have paid disparities, especially when children enter into the picture?
Right, and that is, tell me if you agree with this, but my understanding from research on the pay gap is that there's an argument, at least, that it lessens substantially when you compare work in the same fields. That so much of it has to do with, yes, women are disproportionately in fields that maybe you argue should be paid more. If you have a master's degree, you should be paid more in an ideal world, but it's just not the case.
Actually, the gender pay gaps, the research on that front shows that they're largest for high-income women. And that's certainly, if you look at people within the same, exactly the same jobs, it's a fairly small pay gap. But this has to do with the fact that, the glass ceiling, in the sense that once you get to higher levels of employment, women kind of face disproportionate burdens when it comes to moving up the career ladder, and that they tend to be even more underpaid relative to men as they move into, managerial jobs or into high-level executive positions. That those kinds of highly paid work don't actually protect women in these kinds of cases, which is why, I mean, yes, we can certainly point to the challenges faced by very low-income women who may have no choice but to work outside the home, or even no choice but to stay home, given the kinds of challenges on that front. The research shows that roughly 75% of stay-at-home moms are in households with incomes of less than $50,000 a year, and most of them end up there because they can't afford childcare. But for couples that are earning combined incomes of, say, $120,000, childcare is on the table. It is possible to find, childcare at those kinds of income levels, but it forces hard questions about how do we make sure that couples are able to make those choices, and that women in particular don't feel pressured to choose to opt out of the workforce simply because they make less money than their partners. Given the kinds of disparities that we have on those fronts as well.
What are we seeing in other countries where there are, let's say, more significant social safety net programs, where there is more maternity and paternity leave on offer? I have a very close friend, for example, who's Canadian and has had 2 small children in the last few years, and gets oohs and ahs at the friend meetups when she talks about taking a year off work and how that is an expectation and that there are fewer kind of repercussions for her as an attorney doing that sort of thing. I have friends in England and other places who have similar kinds of experiences. Do we see different outcomes in terms of the pay gap and career consequences for people when you have different social structures set up to support parents?
Absolutely. So those kinds of investments in social safety nets, essentially other countries have used social safety nets to help families to manage risk, including the risks associated with raising children. And those kinds of social safety nets not only tend to reduce the gender pay gaps, but also reduce buy-in to these kinds of inegalitarian ideas or cultural norms around gender and motherhood, in part because there's less incentive to push women to stay home when we have those kinds of strong social safety nets in place. And the problem is that in the US, we instead try to DIY society. We try to tell people that we don't need a social safety net because people will just manage risk for themselves in the absence of that kind of social support. And certainly there's lots of problems with that kind of a model. But one of them is that, young children aren't capable of managing risks for themselves, which means that someone has to be responsible for them. And oftentimes, because of these kinds of cultural ideas around gender and motherhood, that someone by default is typically presumed to be moms.
Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.